You check your phone. Nothing. You open the chat again, just to reread the last message, even though you already know exactly what it says. You're not dating this person. You're not dating them either. Nobody has said what this is, and somehow that single fact is doing more damage than an actual breakup ever did. You'd think this should be easier than a real relationship. Lower stakes. Less to lose. But the real answer is far stranger. The less defined a relationship is, the harder your brain works to figure it out, and that effort is exactly what's wrecking you. By the end of this, you'll understand why not knowing where you stand with someone can hurt more than knowing something bad, and why your brain would almost rather have a clear rejection than this fog. Hold on to that, because it's going to make a lot more sense soon. Here's what you never noticed about ambiguity. Your brain doesn't just dislike uncertainty. It treats it as a threat to be solved, immediately, using resources it would normally save for actual danger. So why would something as low stakes as an undefined situationship activate a threat response at all? Because your nervous system evolved to care less about how bad something is, and more about whether you can predict it. The neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky spent years studying wild baboons in Kenya, tracking their stress hormones in relation to their social lives. One of his clearest findings was that unpredictability itself, not just danger, was one of the biggest drivers of chronic stress in these animals. A baboon in a stable, clearly defined social rank showed lower stress markers than one whose position was constantly in flux, even when the unstable one wasn't in any more physical danger. Uncertainty was the stressor, not the outcome. That's beat one. But this doesn't fully explain why it's specifically romantic ambiguity that gets under your skin. So let's go further. In the 1970s, the psychologist Mary Ainsworth, building on work by John Bowlby, ran an experiment called the strange situation. She'd bring a toddler and their caregiver into a room, then briefly separate them and reunite them, watching how the child reacted. What she found was that children weren't most distressed by the caregiver simply leaving. They were most distressed when the caregiver's return was unpredictable or inconsistent, unsure whether comfort would actually be available when they needed it. That uncertainty about availability, more than absence itself, is what shaped the most anxious attachment patterns. You're not a toddler anymore. But that same attachment system, built to track whether an important person is reliably there for you, is still running in the background of every situationship. And a situationship is, almost by design, a walking case study in inconsistent availability. So now the stress and the attachment system are both firing. But there's a third piece, and this is the one that makes it almost addictive. In the 1950s, the behaviorist B.F. Skinner ran experiments on pigeons using a lever connected to food. When the lever delivered food every single time, the pigeons pressed it calmly, whenever they wanted a snack. But when Skinner switched to delivering food unpredictably, sometimes after one press, sometimes after 20, the pigeons didn't press less. They pressed more, and they pressed constantly, unable to stop checking. This pattern, called variable ratio reinforcement, produces the strongest, most compulsive behavior of any reward schedule ever tested. It's the same principle behind slot machines. A situationship runs on exactly this schedule. Sometimes the text comes back in 2 minutes. Sometimes it takes 2 days. Sometimes the night ends with them pulling you closer. Sometimes it ends with a vague excuse. You're not checking your phone because you're weak. You're checking it because your brain has been trained, by an unpredictable reward pattern, to believe the next check might be the one that pays off. So here's the twist. It was never really about whether this person likes you enough. It's about the fact that your stress system, your attachment system, and your reward system are all being triggered at once, by the same source, with no resolution in sight. A clean breakup gives your brain an answer. A situationship gives it a question it can never stop trying to solve. And this is exactly why it can hurt worse than actually losing someone. Losing someone, at least, is certain. Your brain can grieve a certainty and eventually file it away. but it cannot file away a question mark. It just keeps returning to it, the way your tongue keeps returning to a chipped tooth, not because it helps, but because the not knowing itself feels unfinished. Think about what you actually do the next time it happens. You don't just feel sad. You investigate. You reread the message. You check when they were last active. You analyze the punctuation. That's not overthinking in the way people dismiss it. That's 3 separate, ancient systems in your brain, all firing at once, all trying to turn an undefined situation into a predictable one, because predictable, to your nervous system, has always meant safe. So the next time you're lying there overanalyzing a text that hasn't come, remember this. You check your phone, again, not because you're desperate, but because somewhere underneath the anxiety is a very old, very reasonable request your brain has been making the whole time: just tell me where I stand.